Hi, Donna. Welcome. Thank you for being here. So, welcome everybody. Thank you guys for being here today. What we're going to do today is have a workshop on memory. And so this will be interactive. As we're going along, I'll be asking you to type some things in the chat. So be prepared for that. Donna, I don't know if your students shout out anything in the class. You can type it in and yeah. So let me share my screen. We'll go ahead and get started. Alrighty. So we're going to talk about the science behind human memory today. And so this is always a really interesting topic because our memory is something that we take for granted all the time. If we didn't have our memory, we wouldn't know how to do everyday things like cook, clean, make tea. You wouldn't know who the people that you know are, right? Everybody that you meet, it would be like you're meeting them for the first time, your family members, your friends. You wouldn't know who you are. Everything that ever made you happy or sad or scared, all of that would all be gone. So I think that we tend to get mad at our memory a lot, especially when we're taking an exam and we can't remember something. But it's something that we shouldn't really take for granted. It's actually an amazing thing, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So just a heads up, this is basically what you're learning is cognitive psychology. So it's a branch, a specific subfield in psychology that talks about anything to do with mental processes, thinking, learning, memory, making decisions, pros and cons lists, how we reason through things, how language develops, all of that would be cognitive psychology. I guess I'll say this too. EPCC doesn't have a cog psych course, but in the intro psychology classes, you'll probably talk about some of this stuff in there too. All right, so first off, a little bit of myth busting. The phrase that we say in psychology all the time is our memory is not like a tape recorder. We really need to come up with something new because we don't use tape recorders anymore. But the way a tape recorder worked is if you wanted to record like a conversation, you can hit record, it would tape it. Later on, you can go back and replay it word for word, exactly like it happened. When we say our memory is not like a tape recorder, it means that you can't do that. You can't record things and then go back and play them later on word for word, exactly like how they happened. Not only that, but whenever when we're remembering something, when we're pulling information out of our head, we don't just like retrieve that perfect little ball of memory and then like put it back. We reconstruct memories. So what that means is every single time we remember something, every single time we bring it to our conscious awareness, we tweak it, we change it just a little bit. And so if you've ever played the game Telephone with your friends, right, where you whisper something into someone's ear and then it goes around the table, and then by the time it gets back to you, it's like a completely different thing. That's kind of how our memories work, right? And even if you know about this, it doesn't make you any less susceptible. Anytime you remember an event, you might add some details in, forget some details happened, details that your friends remembered that you didn't, you might put in there. It's really interesting. Okay, so let's talk about memory. The way that we're going to define memory is learning that persists over time. So essentially, if you remember something, it means you learned it, you stored it in your brain, and later on you can pull it out of your brain. But there's different types of memory, and there's different ways that psychologists measure memory in the lab. So for example, there's something called recognition memory. And the good thing about psychology is all the names make sense. So recognition memory is recognizing something. So when you look at it, you recognize that it's familiar to you. Which is a little bit different from recall memory. So recall memory is recalling information, pulling information out of your head from scratch, essentially. And so what do you all think? What's easier, recognition memory or recall memory? Recognition. Yeah, exactly. Recognition memory is easier. So when we come back here, and it's actually really interesting too, because as we age later on in life, like in late adulthood, our recognition memory remains awesome. We're really good at identifying things that we've seen before. Like if we see a house or a car, we can recognize it as familiar to us. But our recall memory, it's harder when we're younger. It's even harder later on in life. So in late adulthood, you might be able to look at someone's face and recognize that that person's familiar to you, but pulling their name out of your head is going to be even harder. So, like for example, on an exam, a multiple choice question where you have to pick from different answers, that would be recognition. That's why multiple choice tests are easy, right? Because you don't have to like memorize the word in your head. You just have to read it off the paper and say, oh, yes, this is it. That's the definition. Short answer questions tend to be a little bit tougher, or fill in the blank, because that relies on recall memory. You actually have to pull the information out of your head. And then one more thing, because this is something that you all have probably noticed before, but there's a phenomenon in psychology called relearning. So this is essentially the idea that the second time around when we learn things, we pick it up a lot quicker. So if you ever maybe didn't do so hot in a class and had to retake a class, the second time you're in the class, you're like, oh, it makes so much more sense now. Or let's say, for example, you learn about brain areas in intro psych. When you go to a biology class the next semester and they're talking about the same brain areas, you're going to get it a lot quicker. So that's a real scientific finding, and it's called relearning. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the steps in the memory process. So memory is essentially a 3-step process: encoding, storing, and retrieving. And we'll talk about the steps one at a time. Encoding is how information gets downloaded into your head. Storing is our ability to retain information inside our brain. And retrieving it is pulling it out, bringing it to our conscious awareness. So we'll start with encoding first, because this is the most important step. If you don't encode information, if you don't download the information into your head, well, then step 2 is not going to happen. And surely step 3 isn't going to happen. You're not going to remember it on the exam. So I want to spend most of our time today talking about encoding, how to get information to stick in our brains in the first place. And so what happens during step 1 is information, whether it's a phone number or something that you're learning in class, it enters what's called our short-term memory. And then information in our short-term memory gets encoded if we rehearse it, if we repeat that information, if we study it, if we do something with that information. So just because something's in your short-term memory doesn't mean it's going to stick. So let's talk a little bit more about what the heck short-term memory is. When I think of short-term memory, I think of whatever is on my conscious awareness right now, right? So whatever is on your brain, whatever you're thinking about right now, that's in your short-term memory. And short-term memory is called short-term memory because it can only hold a little bit of information and only for a small amount of time, right? So if you think about it, when you're in class, whatever your teachers are saying, that's what's in your short-term memory. When they move on to the next topic, it's gone, right? You don't remember word for word what they said anymore. So for example, this phone number, 915-214-9679. Somebody type that in the chat. All right, let's see if we got it right. 915-214-9679. Yeah, good. Okay, yeah. So essentially what happened is, that's okay. The reason why that was so easy is because we didn't really give ourselves a chance to forget it yet. It was still like fresh in our mind. When things are fresh in our mind, it means that they're literally still here in our short-term memory. But remember, not everything in our short-term memory sticks. So a little bit more about how much we can hold in our head at one time. So the capacity of short-term memory. This was discovered by a guy named George Miller in the 1950s. But basically, our capacity is 7 plus or minus 2. So the average person can have about 7 items in their head, give or take 2. So the range is like 5 to 9. So for example, I remember when I was in college, it used to be that you didn't have to dial the area code before you called somebody. You would just dial the 7-digit phone numbers. And I remember my college professors were like very like grumpy old men. They're like, Miller's magic number 7 plus or minus 2. No one's gonna remember phone numbers anymore. It's too much digits if you add on the area code. But as it turns out, since everyone in your town usually has the same area code, it's not that hard after all. So short-term memory is a little bit different from your working memory. Short-term memory is whatever's on your mind right now, flows in, flows out. When new information comes in, then that's what's in your short-term memory. Working memory is like short-term memory, but on steroids. So this happens when we're actively processing information. So in other words, when you're studying, when you're doing something with that information, when you're repeating it. So for example, for most people here today, that phone number that I told you is probably gone. Was in your short-term memory, floated in, floated out, gone forever. But some of you might have realized like, you know what? This is a memory workshop. I bet you she's going to ask me for that phone number again. And you sat down and you repeated it over and over and over to yourself. If you did that, then you activated your working memory since you were actively processing the information. You were doing something with it. You were studying it, essentially. If anybody did that, go ahead and type that phone number in the chat, and let's see if you got it right. Donna, I know at least one of your students had to have done it. All right, let's see. Ah, cheaters. Oh, that's okay. Yeah, that's not a big deal. But did any, yeah, okay, yeah, so if they saw the chat, then that's okay. Anyways, the number was 915-214-9679, right? So if any of you did sit down and repeat it over and over to yourself, that will be activating your working memory, essentially. So in psychology, we have these things called effortful processing strategies. And remember, all the names in psychology make sense. So it's called effortful processing because it takes effort. Because remember how it works, just because something's in your short-term memory doesn't mean it's going to stick. In order to encode information, to actually like download it into your brain, you have to activate your working memory. You have to do something with that information, right? Whether it's talking to a classmate about it or writing about it, or maybe one of these techniques that we're going to talk about next. So one way to make sure that information sticks in your brain, that's a little memory trick. It's called chunking. So chunking is exactly like how it sounds, right? If you think of a chunk, you think of like I think of like a chunk of meat or like a chunk of ham, right? It's like a piece of something. What we do when we chunk information is we group information into small chunks. And if those small chunks are familiar to us, it makes it even easier. So when we say manageable units or small units, think about, for example, like your credit card. If you, the reason why your number on your credit card is broken down is so that it's easier for you to remember it. It's easier for you to memorize it, essentially. The same thing with your social security number. It's broken down into 3 little like chunks, right? And even when I do my EPCC ID number, right, I always say like 887 blah 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 blah. I break it down in those little chunks, just like my social security number, because one long string of numbers is a lot, but 3 little chunks, that's not so bad. And when we say breaking it down into familiar units, if those individual chunks mean something to you, they're going to be a lot easier to remember. So we'll do a little demonstration. So what I'm going to do is put some letters up on the screen. They're only going to be on the screen for a short amount of time, so make sure you pay attention. And then once they go away, I want you to try to write them down. So if you're ready, here are the letters. Okay, so write down as many as you can. And then just type in the chat, how many did you get? There were 12 of them. Did anybody get all 12? Well, let's try this. Same thing. I'm going to show you some letters. They'll only be on the screen for a small amount of time. So get ready. Here they come. All right. Same thing. Write down those 12 letters. I hate that I can't see the chat. I can't see it. So now, how many did you get? Let's see. Yeah, there you go. Yeah. Was it easier the first time around or the second time around? Oh, Liz, look at you go. What was easier, the first trial or the second trial? The second, yeah. And it's because those little chunks meant something to us, essentially. Yeah, the second for sure. So when we look at here, like we know about the FBI, right? We live in the USA. TMZ is that like trashy news channel. CNN is the liberal news channel, right? So there's those chunks mean something to us, essentially. So let's talk about another type of memory trick. So mnemonics, this is something that you've probably heard of before, even if you didn't know it had this weird fancy name, mnemonic. So a mnemonic is just a fancy way of saying like a memory trick, essentially. So real quick, we're gonna do this again. I'm gonna give you some words. Bicycle, void, cigarette, inherent, fire, process, and we'll come back to them later on. So a mnemonic is just a fancy way of saying memory trick. So if you remember from math class, like PEMDAS, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, that's a mnemonic, that's a memory trick. Or if you've taken like a biological psychology class, you might have to memorize like the 12 cranial nerves. And the saying that they give us was like, on old Olympus's towering tops, something and a something, drink some hops or something. I don't remember it anymore, but I use that little mnemonic, that little memory trick to remember the 12 cranial nerves. The thing that's good about mnemonics is that they work best when they're personally meaningful to you, especially if you can create a picture in your head. So if you think about it, like teachers today, we have it easy, right? Well, we have this beautiful PowerPoint slide that can cue me, prompt me what I want to say next. But back in like ancient Greece, think of those ancient Greece philosophers like Socrates, Plato, whenever they were speaking, they didn't have cues, right? They didn't have this beautiful PowerPoint slide to tell them, remind them what they wanted to talk about next. So what they did was rely on mnemonics, right? They had these little memory tricks that they used to remember what their talking points were, essentially. And again, if you can picture something in your mind, if you can form a mental picture, it helps you remember it even better. It sort of like strengthens that placeholder in your brain. So for example, to remember the capacity of short-term memory is 7, or Miller's magic number 7. You can think of this as psychology's contribution to the sevens, right? Because there's like the 7 deadly sins, the 7 C's, the 7 dwarfs. So you can think Miller's number 7 is psychology's contribution to the 7. Or, for example, your frontal lobe. So your frontal lobe is here, right on the front of your head, right behind your forehead. And it's the part of the brain responsible for thinking, decision making, impulse control, self control, things like that. And by the way, if you're younger than 25, your frontal lobe isn't fully developed yet. It's not until age 25 that all those connections in the frontal lobe are made and we have full reasoning power, right? Which is part of the reason why sometimes adolescents might make some bad choices. And that's okay, it's part of growing up. But my mnemonic to remember the frontal lobe is when people do something not so smart, you face palm. I don't know if you guys can see me or not. I hope you can see me, but if not, it's okay. But when people do something not so smart, you face palm, right? You're like, put your hand to your head and shake your head. Why did they do that? You touch your frontal lobe. And so when I was a student in college, I would remember the face palm and touching your frontal lobe. And that's how I remembered what the frontal lobe was responsible for. And so it's really cool. There's even like memory world championships. And so it's not that these people are like smarter than you, they're just really good at using mnemonics or memory tricks. So they can remember like or memorize the order of an entire deck of cards and then say it back to you just because of the memory tricks that they use in their head. Mnemonics are really great for classes where you have a lot of terminology. So for example, any anatomy class, a lot of the medical classes, medical terminology, maybe some biology classes up there. Any class where you have a lot of vocabulary words that you have to memorize, come up with mnemonics, come up with memory tricks, and come up with a mental picture that you can think of to help you remember that word a little bit better too. So let's go back to those words that we had on the screen at the very beginning of this slide. Go ahead and type those words in the chat. There were 6 of them. So they were the words in the little green bubble down here. Okay. Process fire. Don't remember any. That's okay. Oh my God, Donna, your students got all of them. It's because you have 30 students. Bicycle, void, cigarette, fire, inherent, process. Yeah, that's all 6 of them. Yeah. Process, fire, bicycle, fire, process, cigarette. Okay, yeah. So usually what we see, let's pull this back up here, is a pattern. So for example, students usually tend to remember bicycle and fire and cigarette. Those 3 words stand out. They're like really easy to remember. But inherent and void and process, those ones we kind of had a tougher time remembering them. But why? What's the difference between those 2 categories? Bicycle, fire, and cigarette are easy. Inherent, void, and process tend to be a little bit harder. Yes, something that we could, yeah, they're concrete. Something that we can visualize. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So in other words, you can make a mental picture of it in your head. So for example, if you wanted to try to remember these, you could remember a person riding their bicycle down the road, lighting their cigarette, like lighting a lighter with fire to light a cigarette or something like that. But when you think of like the word inherent, like I don't have a default picture in my brain for the word inherent, right? I would have to like think of it and come up with one. As a bicycle, I can picture that right away. A bicycle, my default picture is blue, even though I never owned a blue bicycle, right? Void, I guess maybe you could think of like space, process, maybe some arrows, but we don't have like a default picture that's like a prototype that exists in our brain, essentially, if that makes sense. So I encourage you, if you have a lot of vocabulary words, to use those mnemonics, use those memory tricks. Okay, and now we're going to talk about the two very best techniques. So this, especially for students when you're studying for your exams, this is what you want to do. So I'll have some real talk here. I hope I don't get fired for saying this. But honestly, when I was a student, I used to cram, right? And so I would be studying for something, and like the morning before or the night before, I would just cram and I would read over my notes. And essentially, what I would do is memorize my notes, have all that stuff in my short term memory, do a brain dump when I was taking the exam, and then next week it would be gone. But that's okay because I got an A on my exam, right? Let me tell you why that's a bad thing. In real life, your GPA doesn't matter as much, right? I was very concerned, wanted to be the perfect student, straight A student, always had to get A's, but I don't even remember my GPA anymore. Don't remember it, and kind of don't care to remember it. It's not important. As an adult, it's not important anymore, right? Not only that, but your employers aren't going to care if you have a straight 4.0 GPA. They care, do you know the material? Did you actually retain the information that you need to do the job? So the problem is, if you cram all that information, are you going to get an A on the exam? Yeah, probably. But are you going to remember it? No. Yeah. So that's what these two techniques are going to help you do, help you remember the information long term so that when you graduate, it's still there in your head, right? You didn't forget it all and don't remember anything about that class at all. So the first technique we're going to talk about is called the spacing effect. And this is just a fancy way of saying if you space out your studying, you remember the information. If you cram, again, yeah, you'll get an A, but you're not going to retain the information. So especially the classes out of your major, make sure you don't cram, right? Make sure you're spacing out your studying. What that means is studying a little bit each day. Study a little bit on Monday, study a little bit on Tuesday, study a little bit on Wednesday. That's how you get the information to stick in your brain. That's how you encode information. There's also something called the testing effect. And this is really cool. Okay. And both of these findings are like really like verified, replicable findings in psychology. Like we know for sure that these exist. So the testing effect says that we remember things better after we practice retrieving information, after we practice pulling information out of our heads, rather than just rereading it. So what that means is if I'm a student and I'm taking notes, I don't want to sit there and just reread my notes over and over and over again, like what I did when I was in college before I knew better, right? And even using the highlighter, like the highlighter is okay, but it's not necessarily the best way to study. The best way to study, if you want to get A's in your classes and remember your information, is use the spacing effect, study a little bit each day, spread out your studying over time, and the testing effect. Practice recalling the information, practice pulling it out of your head. So the number one mistake that students make all the time, I use these Dr. Seuss stickers. So let's say that this is your exam material that you have to know for the exam, right? You can look on that and be like, okay, da-da-da, da-da-da. Yeah, that looks familiar. As you're reading over the exam material, everything's going to sound familiar because recognition memory, it's easy. What you really want to do to see, do you know the information before you take an exam, is start on a blank piece of paper and then write down everything that you know. By doing that, you're practicing pulling it out of your brain. You're practicing retrieving information. And honestly, it doesn't have to be a boring way to study. So I tell my students this all the time, even talking to your friends, it's a really good way to study for an exam. If you go over and talk to your friends or family members or dogs or stuffed animals or fish, whatever you have, if you explain to them what you're doing in your class, you're practicing pulling that information out of your head, right? That's part of the reason why they say the best way to learn is to teach, right? If you sit down and essentially teach your class to someone else or even just talk about it to somebody else, you're already going to do better on the test. So the testing effect, it doesn't necessarily have to be like taking quizzes or practice tests, but even just practicing pulling that information out of your brain, essentially. So just to reiterate, because this is really important, we retain information better if encoding is spread out over time. And cramming, rereading your notes, highlighting, those aren't the best ways to study, right? If you want to study, then you practice pulling the information out of your head. And so there's a psychology researcher, his name was Hermann Ebbinghaus, and he studied forgetting. And a lot of times he studied himself, so it was really cool. But he had this saying. He said, "Those who learn quickly also forget quickly." So it's kind of like weight, right? The quicker you lose it, the quicker you gain it back. The same thing for information we want to retain in our brain. The quicker you learn it, the quicker you forget it. If you cram, you're going to forget it. Okay, another technique that you can use are called hierarchies. And so if you have a hierarchy, you're just organizing stuff from like really broad and then getting more and more narrow, essentially. So for example, if my topic is like cognitive psychology, and then we're looking at memory. Remember, there's other things under cognitive psychology like thinking and language development. And then there's different steps of memory, encoding, storing, retrieving. And then chunking, mnemonics, hierarchies. All of this is just underneath step 1, encoding. That would be using a hierarchy. The way that you can do this as students is when you're taking notes, right? And some of you might do this naturally, but let's say that the teacher says, okay, we're starting a new chapter today, chapter 5, cognitive psychology. Maybe at the top middle of your paper, you write chapter 5, cognitive psychology, really big. And then the main headings, maybe you underline them. Or maybe you indent or use bullet points or something like that to show like chunking is underneath encoding, mnemonics is underneath encoding, hierarchies is underneath encoding. Does anybody sort of do something similar like that, like how you organize your notes? Or maybe you use different colors. Underlining, the spacing, using indents, putting things in the middle versus over to the side. Yeah, okay. I'm like, what is this? Okay. Yeah, so if you do that, then you're already using hierarchies in your notes. All right, the last one we're going to talk about is levels of processing. So basically, this is the idea that we can process information like on a shallow level, like barely thinking about it, just thinking about what it looks like. Or we could process information semantically on a deep level. So the word semantic means meaning, right? So like fun fact, if you ever said a word over and over and over again, like for example, my daughter's Valentine's for her school, I had to write out to my friend from Vera. And after like the 10th time of writing the word friend, it lost its meaning to me. And I was like, is this even a word? I actually had to take out my phone and say, am I spelling this right? Because it lost its meaning. That's a real thing. It's called semantic satiation. When you essentially say a word so many times that it loses its meaning to you. So thinking about what things mean, that's how you encode information on a deep level. So let's say, for example, you were in a psychology experiment and they were showing you words on the screen. If you saw the word chair and they just asked you, is it in all capital letters? You could just look at that really quickly. You don't even have to read the word to just answer, yes, it's in all capital letters. No, it's not in all capital letters. But guess what? Later on, when you're giving a recognition test, and remember, humans have really good recognition memory. And when they ask you, did you see the word chair? You're like, no, I don't think so. Because you weren't really paying attention to the word. You're just looking at what it looked like. But if they had you do something like, would the word fit in the sentence? The girl put the blank on the table. Then you'd have to think about it, right? The girl put the chair on the table. Yeah, I guess that makes sense, right? Like maybe she's a waitress. They're cleaning up the restaurant at night. Yeah, okay, I'll say that's yes. The girl put the doll on the table. Yeah, sure. A little girl can put a baby doll on the table. Yeah, I'll say that's a yes. Later on, when they give you a recognition test, when they say, hey, do you remember chair? Do you remember doll? You're going to say, yeah, I remember those words. Because you're thinking about the meaning of a chair, the meaning of a doll, would it fit in those sentences, instead of just really shallow things like what it looks like, what it sounds like, stuff like that. So what that means for you as a student, how you can use this is when you're learning words, when you're memorizing information for your exam, think about what stuff actually means, right? One of my favorite things to do is to break down words into like prefixes and suffixes and stuff like that. Like the prefix hypo means below, so this word has to mean below something or whatever you're doing. But if you break it down and think about the meaning of the words, it'll help you remember that information better. Okay, all of that was just step one, encoding memories. Let me check the chat real quick. I know I heard a couple of things. Oh, thanks, Donna. Thank you for being here. Yeah. So looking at storing memories, this is step 2 of the memory process. Basically what happens in storing is information goes from short-term memory into long-term memory. Remember, anything can go in our short-term memory. It's not going to get encoded though unless we rehearse it. Once information goes from short-term memory to long-term memory, that's what's considered to be storing information. And something that's really cool is that we say that the brain is not like a library. So we used to think that there used to be like a specific place, like right here is where your memory of your 17th birthday was stored, and right here is where you stored what you had for breakfast last year or something like that. And it's not like that. Like there's a specific place that memories go. So if you ever saw the movie Inside Out, where they have those like perfect little balls of memories, it doesn't work like that in real life. When we say the brain is not like a library, what we mean is that memories are actually stored all throughout the brain, essentially. And so when we look at storing memories, the best tip or trick I can give you for this step is get a good night's sleep. So there's a thing that happens called memory consolidation. And that's the fancy way of saying information goes from short-term memory to long-term memory. It's literally step 2 of the memory process. That happens when we're sleeping. So if you think about it, I'm sure, I know my parents used to tell me like, oh, you have an exam, get a good night's sleep, get a good night's sleep. And I would be like, no, I'm going to stay up all night and study because I blew it off and I didn't study earlier in the week. But there's a reason why they tell you to get a good night's sleep, and it's because it works, right? That's when memory consolidation happens. That's when stuff goes from short-term memory to long-term memory and helps you remember it better, essentially. The hippocampus is especially important. It's a part of the brain that allows you to download new information into your head. It's kind of like the save button of the brain. So if you ever saw the movie 50 First Dates with Adam Sandler and I think Drew Barrymore, she had something wrong with her hippocampus. So it was like every night when she went to bed and then woke up the next day, it was like starting that whole day over, like repeating that day. She had no memory of the previous day. It doesn't work that cleanly in real life, but there are conditions that happen like that in case there's something wrong with your hippocampus. So the lesson is get a good night's sleep before you take the exam. And finally, our last step is retrieving memories. So encoding is how information gets into your head in the first place. Storing is when it moves to long-term memory storage. Retrieving is remembering. It's pulling information out of our head, pulling information out of our brain, essentially. So you're bringing it out of long-term memory and bringing it to your conscious awareness. And there's things that you can do, little tips and tricks you can do to help trigger retrieval, to help make it easier for you to pull some things out of your head. Because if you think about it, honestly, there's different reasons why we forget. So maybe it was never encoded in the first place. But sometimes you can encode information You can store it in a long-term memory, but you're having trouble retrieving it and you need something to help you trigger retrieval. So for example, I'm sure this has happened to you before where you're talking and there's a word that you know you want to use and you use this word all the time, but you can't think of it and you're like, what is that word? And it's a real thing. It's called tip of the tongue phenomenon because the word is like, it's right there. It's right there on the tip of my tongue. I just can't get it out, right? That would be a case where there's something wrong with step 3 in the memory process. You encoded the information, you stored it, for whatever reason, your retrieval was blocked. So what we're going to talk about next are retrieval cues. So things that will make us more likely to retrieve information that we've already learned. So this is cool stuff. So we'll talk about context-dependent memories first. When we say context, what we're talking about is the environment or the situation. And the idea here is that if you are in the same situation that you learned something in, it's going to help facilitate retrieval. So this was a bizarre study. I don't know who thought of this, right? Okay, but in the study, they were testing scuba divers and having them learn like word pairs. And so some of the scuba divers, like they learned on the land and then they took a test in the water. Don't ask me how. And they didn't do so good. Or they learned in the water and they took a test on the land and the same thing, they didn't do so good. But if you learned on the land and took a test on the land, you did great. And if you learned the word pairs on the water and took the test in the water, you did great. And the reason why is because the context, the actual situation, whether you're on land or in water, that can trigger retrieval. And it kind of sounds like it's almost too hard to believe, but if you've ever experienced something out of context, you know just how confusing that can be, right? So think about maybe, for example, you saw your doctor at Walmart or your dentist at Walmart. And you'll sit there and you'll look and you're like, I know that person. Really, but who are they? I can't remember, right? Because they're not in the same context. They're not in the same situation that you normally see them in. As soon as they're in that situation or context, then you're like, oh, okay, I know who you are, right? And one of my coworkers, I see him every single day and I talk to him. I saw him at a restaurant, one of those like Buttersmith or whatever restaurants. And I felt like I accosted him and his wife as I went up to them. I was like, hey, how you guys doing? And they had no idea who I was because they always see me at EPCC, seeing me off campus. They're no idea who I was, right? Have you guys ever experienced something like that before? Does that kind of ring a bell? Yeah, no, that's happened to me a couple of times too. Yeah. And it comes back when you're not expecting it. Um, and so the reason why that happens again is because it's the power of the situation, the power of the environment. So as students, what you can do to help you better remember things is to make your testing environment as similar as possible to your study environment. So what that means is think about how when you take your test, usually the room is quiet. You're not allowed to have music or anything. Probably cold in the classroom, right? So that means when you study, you want to make that test as similar, or you want to make your environment as similar as possible to your testing environment. So you don't want to be studying like warm and cozy on your bed, listening to loud music, talking to your friends, things like that. You want your study situation to be as similar as possible to your testing situation. If you chew gum when you're studying, you want to chew gum when you're taking the exam, because those little things can serve as retrieval cues to help you remember information better. And then finally in retrieval, we'll talk about state-dependent memories. So here when we say state, we literally mean like your emotional state or your state of mind. So for example, what you learn in one state is more easily recalled when you're in that state again. Okay, so disclaimer, I use drunk versus sober here. Disclaimer, memory is always worse when you drink alcohol. No matter what, when you drink alcohol, your memory is always a little bit worse. But you might have experienced maybe one time you were, I don't know, out at the bar and had a couple of drinks. You came home, you had 20 bucks left over. You wanted to hide it so that your little sibling didn't steal it. And so you hid it somewhere in your room. And then the next day you woke up and you're like, where did I hide that money? And you have no idea. But the next drink, you can find it again, essentially. It's because your state of mind actually serves as a retrieval cue and helps you pull information out of your head. And it's not just a state, whether like drunk or sober, but also your emotional states too. So, for example, you probably have noticed this that whenever you're in a bad mood, it's so much easier to think about all the other times that you're in a bad mood, right? So if you're mad at your significant other, oh, it's so much easier to think about all their faults, all the things that are wrong with them, all those memories, they're easy to access. The same thing with happy moods, though, right? So whenever we're in a good mood, it's a lot easier for us to think of other times that we were in good moods and think about happy thoughts, essentially. Okay, and so I guess this will be the very last thing because I think I'm almost out of time, right? We have until 1:50. There is something in psychology called the serial position effect. And so this is basically the idea that the last things that we learn, we tend to remember better. And also the first things that we learn, we remember better. So what that means is, let's see, the very first thing that we talked about in this lecture today was recognition memory and recall memory and relearning. According to the serial position effect, when we sign off here today, that's going to be one of the things that you remember. It's called the primacy effect. And the reason why it happens is because since we learned it first, we had more time to rehearse it. So you can think about it as learning the names of people at a party, right? Let's say you go to the party and you meet somebody and someone's like, my name's Tom. And you're like, all right, Tom, 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 Tom. And you repeat it so you don't forget it. Then you meet 5 people in the middle, their names are gone forever. The last person's name who you remember, you still remember them because it's still in your short-term memory. You didn't have a chance to forget it yet. So we usually tend to remember the first and the last things first better. The stuff in the middle is what we tend to forget, essentially. And so when we're studying, the implication for that is pay attention to the stuff in the middle of the chapter, because that's what you're going to be most likely to forget. Do you want me to keep going? Okay. Thanks, Liz. Okay, yeah. Yeah, so there's one last slide. I guess we can cover this. And so remember earlier we said that there's not one place in the brain where memory is stored. When we say that, what we mean is that information in our memory is interconnected. They're intertwined. You can kind of think of memory as this like web of associations, like a literal like spider web. So for example, in my class, we do this demonstration and I tell the students, write down all the words you can think of that have to do with the word strawberry. And I get all kinds of stuff out there, right? Because if you think about it, there's lots of different things. You can think of other fruits. You can think of strawberry shortcakes. You can think of summertime. You can think of strawberry blonde hair. You can think of strawberry milkshakes or ice creams or strawberry yogurts. Oh, look, they have ice cream on their choice. The color, strawberries are red. What they taste like, delicious. You know, there's so many different directions that you can go in. And the reason why is because the concept of a strawberry doesn't exist like isolated in our brain. It's connected to lots of other concepts. So that's what we mean when we say memory is like a web of associations or like a spider web, essentially. And so the best way to demonstrate this, I found as an instructor, is learning the names of the people in your classroom. So for me, it's learning my students' names. But for you guys, maybe if you like know your classmates' names, if you think about it on that first day of class when you learn everybody's names. So on my, at least in my classrooms, my students have to do like this speed dating thing where they introduce themselves and they learn each other's names. On that first day, they encode each other's names, they download them into their brain. But let's say that, for example, something happens and they forget someone's name. Well, the way memory works is you didn't just encode that person's name, but you encoded information about their mood and your mood and where they were sitting in class relevant to where you were sitting in class, what color clothing they were wearing, whether or not they had glasses, all of that other supplementary information they encoded. So let's say, for example, you met somebody on the first day of class and they're like, my name's Brian, and he was wearing a bright red sweater, and then you totally forgot his name for like a week, and then he wore that bright red sweater again. The sweater itself would actually trigger retrieval. As soon as you see the sweater, you're like, ah, that's Brian. Or if you really want to mess with your instructors, you know how everybody usually sits in the same chairs all the time? On that first day of class, when I try to learn everybody's names, again, I'm not just encoding your names, but I'm encoding information about what you look like, what you're wearing, where you're sitting, things like that. So if this were ever to happen, where the second day of class, everybody comes in and they sit in all completely new places, I would have no idea what their names were. Maybe if I'm lucky, I'd remember one. Every once in a while, you get that one or a couple students who like kind of switches seats sometimes, and I'm just like, who are you? You were on the other side of the room last time. You can't be this person, right? It's because we encode lots of information, not just the name, but other things to do with that person's name. Okay, and so that is it. That's the end of my presentation. Hopefully you all enjoyed it. So I guess we'll open it up now for questions, if anyone has any questions over everything. Yeah. Wait. Thanks. Let's see. A couple people. Yeah, thank you guys for being here. So if you have any questions, you can unmute yourself and ask, or you can type them in the chat. Thank you. Glad you liked it. If you take psychology classes, you'll get a whole lot more of this. Yeah, so if there's no questions, I guess you guys are good to go to sign out. But I'll stay on here for a few minutes.